That was Nathan King reporting. We're going to join him live in just a bit. I want to bring Jessica back into our conversation along with George Moore. And George is a senior analyst covering nuclear security at the International Atomic Energy Agency. He's joining us live from Monterey, California. George, first to you. The U.S. president had a lot riding on this summit. He said these leaders came here to act. This isn't an issue that gets flashy headlines, but they made significant progress, he says. Do you think they did?
I believe they have. I've read the communique. Let me correct one thing. I'm no longer with the IAEA. I'm a scientist in residence here at Middlebury, Monterey. But this is a very significant, particularly the agreement of the states. Enough states have now ratified the 2005 amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material that it will go into effect in 30 days. And this is a very important document that will bring a lot of physical security standards worldwide to facilities on a domestic level.
George, is this the most that could be expected out of this summit? I mean, was this the home run?
I think that this is a very important thing. It's unfortunate that the Russian Federation was not at the summit. They stayed away for political reasons, but I don't think too much should be made of that because the Russian Federation, particularly through the International Atomic Energy Agency, is very cooperative and has a lot of very similar interests to China and the United States and the other nuclear states in the world.
Jessica, U.S. President Barack Obama said Friday that Iran is making real progress living up to the terms of its recent deal. I want to play something from Rose Gottmuller, what she told CCTV about this very issue. She's the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Let's listen.
The Iran deal at the very highest level is healing a serious wound in the non-proliferation treaty regime. And so it's important at that high level. But at a more detailed technical level, the Iran nuclear deal is also providing us some new tools for nuclear safeguards processes. We will have eyes on every step of their enrichment process, and that's a very important technical step forward.
Steps forward. Let's talk about momentum on the international level. Is there a lot of it right now on nuclear issues?
Certainly seems like it. I mean, I think that with respect to the Iran nuclear deal, we saw such unparalleled international unity around those international sanctions that it took to get to Iran to the bargaining table. And then just throughout the whole process over the course of 2 years, you saw really unprecedented involvement from countries that don't always work well together, Russia, China, the United States, and members of the European community as well. And they really were all able to bring together a plan, and they're all going to be part of the execution. As Undersecretary Guttmuller referred to, you know, each country that was at that table is going to be responsible for various parts of dismantling the nuclear program in Iran and monitoring the nuclear program in Iran. And so I think that's really key too, where she talks about the learning. This is going to be a learning experience for all of the countries that were involved in those talks and really for the world.
And George, another area that these leaders addressed, of course, security, with Obama in his closing statement saying every single country now has enhanced security at the nuclear facilities. When the first summit was held here in Washington in 2010, there really wasn't an ISIS. So the landscape and the concerns have really changed since the start of these summits. Wouldn't you agree?
I think that's true. I think there's certainly a broader international recognition of the threat. The threat has always been there. You know, ISIS is just the latest in a series of terrorist groups which have expressed an interest in some form of nuclear or radioactive material terrorism.
And George was mentioning the absence of Russia. Nathan's live with us now. Let's talk a little bit about the nuclear arsenals out there. The U.S. and Russia have the bulk of them, literally 93% of the warheads out there. What about the absence of Russia at the summit? It's one of those glaring weaknesses of this summit, if you want, because they just were not there.
Yeah, they weren't there at a high level at all. The Russian ambassador to the U.S. did attend a few meetings, but yeah, they were really low level. And you know, the U.S. and Russia disagree on everything from Ukraine to Syria, so that is not good. And you know, the Obama administration did say several times they would have liked it if Russia had been here. And this is a big question going forward, because as you know, this was the 4th summit. This was very much US President Barack Obama's baby. So what happens now in terms of at a leader level to this process, and can Russia be brought back into the fold? There's lots of talk of another country, for example, stepping up to the mantle. I've heard India's name bandied about a few times, because this contact group that they've announced, this joint working group, I'm sure it's going to do great work, but nothing really beats global leaders focusing their country's attention on this sort of threat. And you know, Russia has a lot of expertise when it comes to dealing, obviously, with the threats of nuclear terrorism and, of course, proliferation in general.
And George, Nathan makes a really important point. You bring all of these leaders into a room, things get done. In his closing statement, Obama asked this question: how do we build on this last leader-level summit? How do they build on it?
Well, I think the assumption is that the IAEA will take a lead in this area. They are planning a ministerial level conference to kind of follow on to the summit process, and that will probably be an annual or every other year event dealing with nuclear security issues. I think the first one is scheduled for this fall or winter in December in Vienna.
Can they keep the momentum going?
Well, one certainly hopes so. That's the intent. You know, it's one of those things where this is nuclear security is an expense. It's one of those things like having insurance that you don't, you have to pay for continually, or you don't have a good insurance policy. And so if the world leaders keep that in mind and keep the emphasis and effort in establishing and maintaining, and that sustainability and maintaining is a very important concept. They need to do that. That interest needs to stay there. Unfortunately, ISIS and the threat of some sort of nuclear terrorism is a long-term process. It's not going to be dealt with in a year or 2 years or maybe even 10 or 20 years. So the world needs to maintain a commitment to nuclear security.
George, thank you for your thoughts. And Nathan and Jessica, why don't I start with you, Nathan? Your final takeaways from the summit.
Well, I mean, what the standout for me is that everyone is taking this seriously. You know, a lot of different countries who have a lot of differing views, the US and China, for example, really hammering out some details. What stood out for me with the US and China was this deal to convert highly enriched uranium reactors into low uranium reactors. You can't use lowly enriched uranium for weapons. Plants in China will happen, Chinese-built plants, for example, in Nigeria and Ghana. And remember, the Chinese nuclear industry is growing not just inside its borders, but also in Central Asia along the new Silk Road Initiative. So all these standards will be rolled out over the next 10 to 20 years. Although the civilian nuclear industry only accounts for about 4%, I think, of nuclear stockpiles around the world. And the elephant in the room, of course, is the nuclear arsenals of the big powers.
And Jessica, how about you? Your final thoughts?
Well, I think what was interesting to me is just to hear how often U.S. President Barack Obama and President Xi Jinping of China were in the same room, were seated next to each other, running these meetings together. They sat next to each other at multiple events throughout the last 48 hours. And you heard just a lot of credit being given to the Chinese by the Americans for everything from just sort of the nudge that it took from the Chinese in many cases for this convention to take place, this treaty to take place, to the Center of Excellence that was just unveiled and what that portends for regional training in the Asia Pacific ahead, which of course is the fastest growing area of the world for nuclear power and therefore a concern for nuclear proliferation.